Well, as I said, I was a very curious child, and I saw when I came, I was the oldest child on both sides of my family, and my dad's whole side of the family came together via the Camarioca boat lift, and we settled in Naples, Florida, in a Cuban American community that was just starting up. And so, being the eldest, I learned English very quickly, and I actually served as an interpreter for the adults that had to go to the doctor or to the bank or to the DMV. And so, I know this community inside and out.
Welcome to Forum, Beyond the Pages, the podcast that tells the stories behind the stories of Florida Humanities award-winning magazine. I'm Andrew Quintana. We're all about great storytelling the rest of this season as we speak with some of the Florida Book Award winners featured in our summer 2025 issue of Forum. This week, author Aracelis Gonzalez Asendorf on her recent book, Dressing the Saints. This past June, Florida Humanities Center for the Book took part in its annual tradition of selecting a pair of titles to represent the Sunshine State at the National Book Festival in Washington, D.C. One of those books is Aracelis Gonzalez Asendorf's award-winning novel, Dressing the Saints, a series of short stories that vividly explore the everyday lives of Cuban Americans. As Asendorf discusses in this episode, the stories in her book are meant to honor a dying generation of Cuban exiles. In your conversation with Forum's very own Janet Scherberger for the summer issue, you said that this book is about your parents' generation. What made you want to go back and write about one of the earliest generations of Cubans that fled Fidel Castro's regime?
Well, I came from Cuba with my family when I was 8 years old, and I loved listening to their stories. And I was very curious, and I asked a lot of questions. And when I started writing, I found that that generation kind of came through my writing, and that they had a lot of stories to tell. So no story in the collection is true, but most of the stories have at least a little seed of truth in them from something that sparked my imagination via one of these conversations that I would have with this extended family or with the people in my community. And I thought that I was in a position to write these stories. And they were interesting to me, the lives that they had led prior to coming to the United States and then forging new paths here in Florida, and then the lives that they lived after that.
It's funny that you talk about not all the stories in this collection of short stories are necessarily true, because I was curious about that. You know, they always say write what you know, and just based on the authenticity in the stories, it feels like you know a lot about the internal challenges that some of these characters face as immigrants. Obviously, you are from Cuba, like you said. So I just want to know how much of this was inspired from real life.
Well, as I said, I was a very curious child, and I saw when I came, I was the oldest child on both sides of my family, and my dad's whole side of the family came together via the Camarioca boat lift, and we settled in Naples, Florida, in a Cuban American community that was just starting up. And so, being the eldest, I learned English very quickly, and I actually served as an interpreter for the adults that had to go to the doctor or to the bank or to the DMV. And so, I know this community inside and out. So that provided a lot of fodder for my fiction. So, for example, in Dressing the Saints, I knew of some women who were, as the community says, left to dress the saints. And so I was curious about their lives. And then I was curious if perhaps they were gay, and that's why they never married. So even though I don't know anybody who lived exactly as they are portrayed in Dressing the Saints, I knew enough about them to be able to write the story. The same way with the Harbor pilot, I wanted to write that story because a friend of my dad's met somebody in Miami on the street who had kind of tried to block his departure from Cuba, my dad's friend. And he was very angry that he was pro-communism and pro-Fidel. And then he ended up leaving. And when he encountered him in Miami, he basically punched him. And so I thought, wow, that's really a very strong image. And so I wrote the Harbor pilot thinking of that incident. So again, little seeds here and there, but I'm very comfortable in the community. It's how I grew up. So I know the community and the characters intimately in that sense.
I think many of the stories in the book deal with losing one's identity, obviously, not just as an immigrant, but even as a man, a woman, a wife, or a husband. The two stories I think focus on both sides of that coin are The Lost Ones and Emelina, which follow a married couple's change in routine after the husband suffers a roofing accident. What inspired you to write a story from both of those perspectives, and what made you so interested in exploring domestic roles?
So I wrote The Lost One first. And when I was 4, there was a possibility that I could have been a Pedro Pan child. My mom said that they had procured a visa just in case they thought that it was necessary to send me to the United States. And I would have come to live with my aunt if that had occurred. And thank goodness it didn't, because I never was separated from my parents. But I had heard and met other Pedro Pan kids who did leave their families, who were separated for a period of time. And I did know a Pedro Pan child who never really connected with their parents. They never lost communication via correspondence, but they never were reunited. But I didn't know what the story was. And so I kept notes about a story. And then a strange thing occurred one day, bringing my kids back from school. I stopped at a nearby convenience store, and I ran into this woman who was a migrant worker who had been left there by a taxi, and that wasn't where she needed to be, and she was lost. And she asked if I could help. And so I said, well, let me take my kids home. I only live 5 minutes away. I promise I'll come back and help you. So I returned, and I eventually ended up driving her to a Mexican convenience store, basically, about 15, 20 minutes from my home, where she reunited with her brother. And so I thought, well, she belongs in this Lost One story. And so the two characters, my interest in in the Pedro Pan children and my interest in this woman just kind of merged and became this story. And as I was writing it, Emelina, the wife, her voice became very loud in my head, but it wasn't her story. So I thought, well, after I finish The Lost Ones, I sort of made her a deal. Let me write The Lost Ones, which is really Ephraim's story, and then I'll write your story. And so about 2 years later, after writing The Lost Ones, I went back and wrote Emelina. And I was curious about a marriage where one person feels like they have more invested in the relationship than another person, and how that dynamic might play out.
For a book that's so focused on capturing the Cuban diaspora, you don't linger on some of the most obvious moments that brought people to this country. I have a lot of images in my head from the stories that are more of the mundane everyday life that these characters kind of exist in. Like you mentioned, your real life story of helping that woman at the convenience store, Emelina, and her routine being thrown off with her husband being home all the time. Was it an intentional choice to write about some of the more everyday details of these people's lives?
I don't know that it was intentional. I think you start a story with an idea, and then the story reveals itself. It sort of evolves, and then you have to decide which lane you're going to take it down and see where it goes. Real characters are set in the mundane, right? How you go about your day, what happens. I mean, obviously, momentous events occur in all of our lives, but we basically live day in and day out. And so these characters, although they are Cuban Americans, and they have a duality to their stories, because there's always the Cuban part of their lives and then the American part of their lives, right? But we all live ordinary lives, and that's where living occurs, right?
Speaking of putting characters in real life situations, because that's where they exist, most of your characters in the book live in the fictional town of Coquina Shores. Why did you choose to create a fake area for stories that are so steeped in real life experience?
So before writing I've written stories for quite a while, but I wrote a first draft of a novel that is based on the Camarioca boat lift, how my family left, and kind of telling their story in a fictionalized way. And it would take place in Naples, Florida. That's where we came and where we settled. So when I wrote that, I decided that I really couldn't use the town Naples, number one, because unless you're familiar with Naples, Florida, and you see Naples, you think of Italy. And number two, because I didn't want my community to think, oh, she's writing about us. So I thought if I just fictionalize it, I have the freedom to take the stories wherever they want to go. And so when I started to write these stories, I thought, well, if I'm going to set them in Florida, I'm just going to stick with Coquina Shores and just create my own community, which is symbolic of a lot of small communities, Cuban American communities throughout Florida. So that gave me a freedom of not having to censor anything because I wasn't really writing about anybody. I was just creating my characters. They were all from my imagination, and I could take them wherever I wanted to go.
Dressing the Saints is your first book, but you've published stories in the past. Are these stories ones you've worked on for years and found the right time to put them all together, or were you always tied to short story writing? Do you ever feel like you wanted to ever explore one of these characters, one of these situations for a full-length novel?
That's a good question. So I wrote for If the Flies first, for the stories of this collection, I wrote for If the Flies first because I wanted to write about a fishing experience. And again, that is the little autobiographical seed is that I would go fishing with my dad and my uncles. And so it's such a wonderful memory for me to just get up early and have Cuban sandwiches and beer for breakfast in the middle of the ocean and spend the whole day out there and then coming back and frying what you caught. And so I wanted to capture that, and it became For If the Flies. I was writing other things, but all of my writing really does center around the Cuban American community. So I decided that I was going to go back and get my master's in creative writing. I wanted more training, and I had these two stories and other stories. And so I decided that for my thesis, I would write a group of stories where the main characters were of my parents' generation, and that would be what tied all the stories together.
I feel like there's a constant feeling of longing in each chapter. I feel like that's the main theme and emotion in a lot of the stories. You know, I go back to the story of Emelina and how she spends most of her story longing for a childhood boyfriend that stayed behind in Cuba, only to find out later during a reunion he's no longer that kid that she remembers. Is that feeling of being disappointed by an idealized version of what once was something that your parents ever struggled with when it came to their past lives in Cuba? Did you ever get that feeling of, you know, we probably don't want to go back?
I think that there's this very strong sense of longing in the Cuban American people of my parents' generation and of my grandparents' generation. Of course, my grandparents' generation has been dead for quite a while, and so the generation that I'm losing is my parents' generation. But my mom and my dad and my aunts and uncles came when they were in their late 20s to early 30s, like say 28 to probably 34, when they came with to the United States. And they were very happy to be here and to know that they could live their lives here in safety and freedom. But there's this idealized version of Cuba that lived within all of them where everything was brighter and the sky is bluer and the flowers are more fragrant and things were much more fun. They don't want to return, but they long for that. And I think that that's true, whether you're an immigrant or not. I mean, if you're an immigrant, I think that you have this longing for the country that you left behind. But I think that now, even as I age, I see within my generation that they long for a time that isn't the time we live in, and they're not looking at the warts. They're just looking at all the wonders. And I think that's a very human thing, to idealize certain aspects of your life if you had a happy life as growing up or in your 20s or whatever. I think that's just human nature. But I think it's highlighted more if you're an immigrant, especially if you're from a country that you can't return. So for the longest time, they really could not go back to Cuba. And so you long for this place that you've created a utopia sort of in your mind about it, about how wonderful it was. If you take out the component of communism in the government, then you long for this utopia and you can't go back to it. I did go back to Cuba in 2017 with my husband and my two children after the embassy was opened. And I invited my parents to come along. And my dad did not want to. And he basically said, I'm happy here. If I go back, it's going to change my memories, and I'd rather keep my memories. For me, it served as a kind of closure because my memories were that of an 8-year-old child. And so I got to see places that they talked about and they had mentioned. And of course, it had changed in the years that the decades since I had left. But it was nice to see it through an adult's eyes.
That was Aracelis Gonzalez Asendorf on her recent book, Dressing the Saints. Forum, Beyond the Pages, is produced by Florida Humanities. Our music was created by Tampa Bay musician JJ Padishal. You can follow him on Instagram at JJ Padishal Music. To read the digital edition of Forum, visit floridahumanities.online. Want to get the latest issue of Forum magazine delivered to your door 3 times a year? Become a Florida Humanities member by visiting floridahumanities.org/membership. Until next time.